Have you ever wondered if the word family really means what it should? I used to believe that as long as I tried hard enough, smiled at the right moments, swallowed my pain, never made waves, family would find a way to love me back. But sometimes, family is just a word. Sometimes it's the place you feel most invisible. My name is Olivia Bennett, and if you're watching this, maybe you know how it feels to be the other child, the one who learns to survive in the quiet. I carried that silence with me for years, thinking it kept me safe. Growing up, I thought love was something to be earned, measured out by how well I behaved, how quickly I forgave, how quietly I disappeared into the background. My little sister Ashley was the sun in our house. I was the shadow, useful, reliable, but never the favorite. I didn't realize how much that shaped me until I became a mother myself. The day my son Lucas was born, I promised him the one thing I'd always wanted: a home, where he would never have to wonder if he was enough. I kept that promise the best I could. We built our own world in a cozy apartment filled with bedtime stories and peanut butter sandwiches, laughter echoing off the kitchen walls. I watched Lucas grow into a gentle, curious boy who loved reading and asked impossible questions. For a while, it felt like the past was behind us. I kept my parents at a careful distance, thinking time would soften old hurts. I was determined that the shadows I grew up with would never touch my son. But life has a way of testing even our strongest promises. One ordinary Thursday, a faulty wire sparked a fire in our apartment. In an instant, the life I'd tried so hard to build for Lucas and me went up in smoke. I stood outside in the cold with my sleepy son clinging to my coat, watching firefighters move through what used to be home. Insurance would pay for a hotel, they said, but it would take weeks to find a place to stay. Suddenly, every option I had led back to the one place I'd sworn I'd never go: my parents' house. As I packed a suitcase for Lucas, his favorite books, his allergy meds, a week's worth of groceries, I told myself it was only temporary. Just a few days, my mother promised over the phone. We'll treat him like our own. Her voice sounded gentle, but I felt old doubts twisting in my chest. Lucas looked up at me, trusting, unaware of the storm of memories churning inside me. I kissed his forehead and whispered, "I'll be right back. Everything will be okay." But some promises are harder to keep than we realize. Before we go any further, let me ask you, what would you do if the people you needed most in the world were the same people who hurt you the deepest? How do you break the cycle when history repeats itself in subtle, painful ways? Today I want to share with you not just what happened to me and Lucas, but what it truly means to fight for your child and for yourself, even when family stands in the way. Stay with me, because this story isn't just about loss. It's about courage, truth, and the kind of love that can heal the deepest wounds. Becoming a mother changes everything, or at least it changed everything for me. The first time I held Lucas in my arms, I felt a love so fierce it frightened me. I looked into his tiny face, pink and wrinkled and perfect, and silently promised him what I had always longed to hear myself: "You will never have to earn my love." That night, as I rocked him to sleep, I made another vow to end the patterns of hurt and favoritism that had shadowed my own childhood. Lucas would grow up certain that he belonged. But keeping that promise wasn't easy. As a single mom, I wore every hat: provider, protector, storyteller, nurse, and friend. There were nights when exhaustion settled heavy on my shoulders, but Lucas's laugh could light up even the hardest day. I remember baking cookies with him on a rainy Saturday, letting him stir the batter even as flour dusted the floor and counters. Those small moments felt like tiny acts of rebellion against the rules. I grew up with rules that demanded neatness, obedience, and silence over joy. In my family, love was always conditional: a reward for good grades, for chores done right, for not making a fuss. I learned early how to tiptoe around my parents' moods, how to make myself useful, invisible. Looking back, I realize how deeply that shaped me. I became an expert at apologizing first, at expecting little. But with Lucas, I wanted to build a home where laughter was never something to be earned, and love never felt like a prize. Every story before bed, every silly dance in the kitchen was a way of rewriting what family meant. Sometimes I worried I was overcompensating. There were nights I lay awake wondering if Lucas would ever sense the fears I still carried: the fear of not being enough, the worry that history would find a way to repeat itself. But children have a way of reminding us what matters. Lucas would crawl into my lap, his favorite book in hand, and say, "Read to me, Mama." In those moments, I realized healing isn't about forgetting the past. It's about doing better, even if you're scared, even if you're tired. Looking around me, I saw other parents wrestling with the same questions. At the playground, I met moms and dads who had grown up in strict households, trying desperately not to pass on the same wounds. Some days we traded stories about setting boundaries, about giving our kids what we never had. We all made mistakes, but the intention was clear: to break the cycle, to offer our children a softer place to land. There is no perfect parent, only parents who try again and again to love more bravely. If there's one lesson I carry from those early years, it's this: cycles are broken. Not in grand gestures, but in the quiet choices we make every day. With every hug, every apology, every bedtime story, we stitch together a new pattern. For Lucas and for myself, I chose to keep trying even when I was afraid. Little did I know life was about to test that promise in ways I could never have imagined. And that's where our real story begins. No one ever expects disaster to knock on their door. For us, it arrived in the middle of an ordinary Thursday evening. Lucas was sitting on the living room rug, carefully piecing together a puzzle while I reheated leftovers for dinner. That's when I smelled an acrid scent of melting plastic. I rushed into the hallway and saw a thin stream of smoke curling from the ceiling light. Within minutes, alarms blared and the building echoed with hurried footsteps. Firefighters arrived quickly, but by the time it was over, our little apartment was deemed unlivable. Everything familiar was suddenly out of reach. Standing on the curb that night, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, I tried to be brave for Lucas. He squeezed my hand tightly, eyes wide and unsure. "Will we go home now?" he whispered. His voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. The building manager assured us insurance would pay for a hotel. But the waiting list for new housing was long and daunting. My mind raced through options, friends, coworkers, even the possibility of sleeping in the car. Each possibility seemed to shrink under the weight of responsibility. All I wanted was to keep Lucas safe and steady in the storm. In moments like that, you learn just how vulnerable you are, how quickly self-reliance can unravel. I called my friend Mariah, hoping for comfort, but she was out of town with family. I thought about reaching out to Lucas's teacher, Mrs. Ellis, but it felt too personal, too exposing. That's the thing about crisis: it strips you down, forces you to confront what you fear most. For me, that meant one undeniable truth. The only place left to turn was the house I had spent years avoiding. I dialed my parents' number with trembling fingers, heart pounding in my chest. When my mother answered, her tone was brisk, but not unkind. "Of course you can come," she said. "Just until things settle down." There was relief in her voice, but also something else, a distance I remembered from childhood, as if offering help was a duty rather than a choice. I explained Lucas's allergies, his routines, the little things that mattered. My father's voice was a low grumble in the background, reminding me of all the unspoken rules in that house. Still, I packed a bag for Lucas, his pajamas, his books, his favorite dinosaur, and a small bag of groceries. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I lay on the hotel bed, replaying every decision, second-guessing myself. Was I doing the right thing? Had I failed Lucas by bringing him back into an environment I'd promised to protect him from? Guilt and worry swirled inside me, heavier than the smoke that had chased us from our home. But sometimes survival isn't about perfection. It's about finding shelter in a storm, about accepting help even when it feels like a step backward. I held on to the hope that this would be temporary, a short detour on our journey to something better. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that strength doesn't always look like never needing anyone. Sometimes it's asking for help when pride wants you to stay silent. In those hours of uncertainty, I realized how many parents, especially single ones, face impossible choices every day. We weigh our fears against our love and choose whatever keeps our children safe. As I sent Lucas off with my parents, I clung to the belief that I could protect him even from a distance. I had no idea then that the true test was only just beginning. Lucas was excited as we pulled up to my parents' house, his arms wrapped around his favorite dinosaur. The Bennett home, with its perfect hedges and red brick path, looked so welcoming on the outside. My mother greeted us at the door, offering a quick, distracted hug before showing Lucas to the guest room. I handed her the list of his food allergies and his favorite snacks, hoping she'd understand how important those small things were to him. My father sat in his armchair silent, except for a brief nod. his newspaper folded in his lap like a shield. That first night I watched Lucas settle into the unfamiliar bed, clutching his dinosaur close. I tried to reassure him that Grandma and Grandpa would take good care of him, that this was just an adventure. Yet a quiet unease crept in. Memories of my own childhood in that house, the unspoken rules, the careful tiptoeing around moods, rose up like ghosts in the corners. I remembered being the child who always tried a little harder to fit in to earn warmth that was sometimes withheld, never quite feeling truly at home in my own family. The next morning I called to check on Lucas before work. His voice was soft, not the bright chatter I was used to. "I had crackers for breakfast," he said. "Papa says real breakfast is for family, and I'm just visiting." My heart ached hearing those words, a familiar sting from years ago. It's amazing how quickly old patterns reappear, how adults, even with the best intentions, sometimes revert to the habits that once wounded their own children. I wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, but something inside me knew better. As the day went on, my worries deepened. I called my mother again, gently reminding her about Lucas's allergies and snacks. She brushed off my concerns, assuring me he was fine, that he just needs to get used to our way. That phrase, "our way," sent a chill down my spine. I wondered how many times I'd heard it growing up, how often children everywhere are expected to adapt instead of being understood. Sometimes love in families comes with silent conditions. Be easy, be quiet, don't disrupt the order. Lucas, with his big heart and gentle spirit, deserved so much more. When I finally saw him the next day, his eyes were downcast, his shoulders small. He tried to smile for me but couldn't hide his disappointment. It hit me then, the harsh truth: children always know when they're not wanted, when they're treated as outsiders in a place that should be theirs. In that moment, I understood how deeply family favoritism wounds not just in childhood, but for a lifetime. The lesson was as clear as it was painful. A child should never have to wonder where they belong or go hungry for love or comfort. Driving away that night, I promised myself things would change. I would not let the cycle repeat for Lucas. He would not be left wondering if he was enough, not for one more day. I began to see that the real work of parenting isn't just about shelter and food, but about making sure your child feels safe, seen, and cherished no matter whose house they're in. This realization was the start of something new, a determination that would soon turn into action, even if it meant challenging everything I'd ever known about family. The moment I realized Lucas was being treated as an outsider, something shifted inside me. I drove straight to my parents' house, barely remembering the road, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. When I arrived, the kitchen was filled with the smell of pancakes and sausage laughter drifting from the dining table. But Lucas sat alone at the far end, his plate empty, his eyes cast down. My father ate heartily, my mother sipped her coffee, but neither looked up when I asked, "Where's Lucas's breakfast?" Their answer was simple and cold: "He already ate." Lucas shook his head softly. "No, I didn't." It's hard to describe the kind of anger and sadness that comes when you see your child diminished in the eyes of your own family. I knelt beside Lucas, brushing a crumb from his cheek, my voice trembling as I told him we were leaving. My mother called after me, her tone more annoyed than apologetic. "You're making a scene over nothing," she said, as if a hungry, lonely child was simply an inconvenience. That moment was a painful echo of my own childhood, all the times my needs had been minimized or dismissed. On the drive home, Lucas sat quietly in the back seat, hugging his dinosaur, refusing the snack I offered. "My stomach hurts," he whispered. I knew then that the pain was deeper than hunger. It was the ache of being unwanted. The confusion of a child who doesn't understand why love feels scarce. That night, as I tucked him in, he wouldn't talk about what happened. Each question I asked was met with silence, the kind that fills a room and lingers long after the lights are out. In that silence, I heard all the unspoken lessons of my own childhood. How easily children absorb the idea that love is conditional, that belonging must be earned. I remembered all the times I'd made excuses for my parents, rationalizing their behavior so I wouldn't have to face the truth. Now, watching Lucas shrink into himself, I knew that the cost of silence was too high. Protecting him meant speaking up even if my voice shook. The old rules: be quiet, don't make trouble, keep the peace, no longer served us. The next morning I called my sister Ashley and told her what had happened. Her response was hesitant, torn between loyalty to our parents and concern for her nephew. "I'm sure they didn't mean it," she said, but there was doubt in her voice. I reached out to my Aunt Ruth, my childhood friend Mariah, even Lucas's teacher. Each conversation felt like a small act of rebellion, choosing honesty over shame, connection over isolation. Some people listened, others changed the subject, but the truth once spoken started to ripple outward. What I learned from this is that the hardest step toward change is often the first word spoken aloud. When you break the silence, you take away the power of old wounds to dictate the future. I couldn't erase what had happened to Lucas, but I could make sure he saw that standing up for yourself and for those you love is not just an act of courage, but a gift. That lesson would soon guide every decision I made as our story reached out into the wider world, and the consequences of truth began to unfold. As word of what happened to Lucas quietly spread, I found myself telling the story over and over, sometimes in hushed voices, across kitchen tables, other times in thoughtful texts late at night. I didn't embellish or seek sympathy, I simply told the truth. Lucas was left out, I'd say. He was told he wasn't family, and he went hungry. The reactions were always the same at first: a shocked pause, a frown, sometimes a hand reaching out in silent support. The hardest part was seeing people I cared about struggle to believe it could really happen in our family. My Aunt Ruth, who had always adored Lucas, was among the first to call. She listened quietly, her voice breaking as she remembered times she'd seen the same pattern when I was young. "I should have spoken up then," she whispered. Even my old friend Mariah, whose own family was far from perfect, admitted she'd always sensed something off in our house, but never wanted to meddle. For the first time, I realized that silence in families doesn't just protect the ones in power, it isolates everyone who wants to help too. The cost of keeping peace can be heavy for all involved. I tried talking to Ashley again, hoping she'd understand, but loyalty to our parents made her defensive. "You're making them sound like monsters," she said, tears in her voice. "They love us in their own way." I understood that kind of loyalty, the need to hold on to the good memories, to believe that love, even imperfect, was real. But I also knew that love without accountability is not really love at all. I didn't want revenge, I just wanted honesty. I wanted Lucas and every child to know that their feelings matter, even if the truth is hard to hear. As days passed, the story grew legs of its own. My cousin shared it with her church group. Lucas's teacher gently reached out to check on him, offering support and extra kindness at school. Small invitations stopped arriving for Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings at my parents' house. My parents noticed the change, calling to ask why people were turning against them. I didn't answer right away. It wasn't about punishment, it was about breaking the silence that allowed hurt to keep spreading. Sometimes truth isn't loud or dramatic. It's just steady, a quiet refusal to hide any longer. Looking back, I see that this was the moment when everything truly started to shift. Not because I was out to ruin anyone's reputation, but because light finally reached the places where secrets had always lived. The hardest thing about healing is that it often begins in loneliness, as old bonds fray and new ones are not yet strong enough to hold you up. Still, I believed in the power of truth, and in the lesson I was passing on to Lucas, that standing up for yourself even when it's hard is how you build a better future. The next chapter of our lives would bring challenges I hadn't anticipated, testing my resolve in ways both public and private. But by choosing honesty, I'd already taken the most important step. Soon, the ripple effect of telling the truth would reach even further, forcing old wounds into the light at the most unexpected time, and in front of the last people I ever thought would see. As the weeks passed, I watched the ripple of truth spread through our family and community. It started with quiet questions. Friends who used to visit my parents every Sunday now hesitated, choosing instead to invite Lucas to their own homes. My cousin, who always praised my parents for their generosity, sent a brief message. "If you or Lucas ever need anything, call me first." Even our neighbor, Mr. Green, who had watched me grow up from behind his picket fence, stopped waving at my father each morning, his silence more eloquent than any confrontation. What struck me most was how quickly social circles shift when a family's reputation is shaken. Invitations to dinners and barbecues dwindled. The phone, once busy with holiday plans, became eerily quiet. My mother left me voicemails in clipped, bewildered tones, unable to understand why the world she'd curated so carefully was suddenly slipping away. My father's messages alternated between angry and pleading, blaming me for turning everyone against us. But I hadn't turned anyone. I'd only opened the blinds, and people saw what they chose to see. I found myself reflecting on how communities in America can be both protective and punishing. When families uphold an image of togetherness and kindness, neighbors rally around them eager to belong. But when the truth surfaces, especially about mistreatment or exclusion, the same communities can withdraw just as swiftly, creating a quiet pressure to change. I saw it all unfolding in real time. Some relatives distanced themselves, unwilling to get involved, while others reached out to Lucas and me, quietly taking our side without ever saying so outright. There were days when I questioned if I'd done the right thing by speaking up. The silence that followed was both a relief and a loneliness. I missed some of the old traditions, even as I recognized how flawed they were. I noticed how Lucas blossomed with the families who welcomed him, how his laughter grew stronger when he knew he belonged. Watching him, I learned that honesty, even when it shakes old foundations, is a form of love. It's a way of saying you matter too much for me to pretend anymore. One evening after dinner, Lucas asked if we would ever go back to Grandma and Grandpa's. I looked into his searching eyes, remembering the ache of my own childhood. "Not unless they learn to treat you with kindness," I said gently. He nodded as if he understood more than his years allowed. That night, as I tucked him in, I promised myself to keep choosing truth, even when it was uncomfortable. The hardest part about change isn't what you lose, it's trusting that what comes next can be better. The next test would come in public at a place where my parents had always shined, the annual community barbecue. I could feel the anxiety rising as the date approached, knowing that our family's story would no longer be confined to whispers and closed doors. What happened there would challenge all of us, setting the stage for a reckoning that had been a lifetime in the making. The day of the annual community barbecue arrived with blue skies and the smell of fresh-cut grass, the kind of day that once filled me with anticipation as a child. My parents' backyard buzzed with laughter and the sizzle of burgers, just as it always had. But this year, I didn't attend. Instead, I called Mrs. Peterson, my old elementary school teacher, and told her everything: how Lucas was treated, the silence, the exclusion. She listened closely, her voice heavy with sadness and a hint of resolve. "Families should feed love, not starve it," she told me, promising she would come to the barbecue. True to her word, Mrs. Peterson showed up in a bright t-shirt that read, "Family means everyone eats." She greeted my parents warmly, but when asked about her grandson, responded just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. I assumed all children were welcome here unless the rules have changed. Conversations stilled. Neighbors exchanged glances, some recalling the whispers that had started weeks before. My mother flushed her practiced smile, faltering. My father tried to make light of it, but Mrs. Peterson's words lingered like the smell of smoke, after a fire impossible to ignore or explain away. Throughout the afternoon, I heard that 2 other neighbors' families I'd quietly confided in brought up the story again during the speeches, asking in casual but clear voices what it truly meant to care for all children. There were no dramatic confrontations, no shouting or tears, just the steady public sunlight of truth. I realized then that change sometimes happens not through anger, but through gentle persistence, by refusing to let injustice remain hidden. When people see the truth even politely, it becomes much harder to deny. My parents spent the rest of the barbecue trying to reclaim control of the narrative, but something essential had shifted. Neighbors became a little more reserved, polite, but distant. The usual laughter around the grill felt thinner, forced. The power my parents held, their reputation for warmth and generosity, no longer blinded others to what was happening behind closed doors. As I heard later, even those who had been closest to them were now asking questions quietly, reconsidering what it meant to be good people in the eyes of the community. What struck me most was how no one stormed out or raised their voice. The change was subtle but profound, like the first chill of autumn that signals a new season. It was a reminder that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes it only needs to be spoken in the right room at the right moment. I understood then that I hadn't destroyed my parents' world. They had built it on foundations too fragile to last. By telling the truth, I had simply let the light in. In the days that followed, the quiet around my parents' home grew heavier. Fewer guests stopped by, invitations dried up, and the phone seldom rang. My parents struggled to understand why clinging to their routines, even as their world contracted. I realized this public reckoning was both an ending and a beginning. For Lucas and me, it meant a new chapter 1 that would finally allow us to define family on our own terms. But before we could move forward, there was still one more truth to face and a final lesson to learn about letting go. As autumn settled and a quiet emptiness filled my parents' house, the porch lights flickered on each evening, but few visitors ever crossed the threshold. My mother baked pies and set the table for guests who never came. My father watched old sitcoms in his recliner, the silence between commercial breaks almost deafening. The house that once hosted birthdays, holidays, and laughter now echoed with absence. Melissa called me one evening, her voice soft. "They're lonely," she said, almost pleading. "Dad wanders the hallways. Mom keeps hoping people will forgive and forget." I listened, feeling the ache of old wounds, but not surprise. I realized then that loneliness can be the heaviest consequence of choices made in pride and denial. My parents had loved their image of family, but struggled to love the real people within it. In their world, tradition mattered more than tenderness, reputation more than relationship. The house was spotless, but the warmth was gone. Lucas and I drove by one afternoon, parking across the street. He asked, "Does anyone live there?" The question lingered between us. I watched the curtains twitch, but nobody waved, nobody smiled. It was as if the house itself had chosen to close off from the world. That visit brought me an unexpected sense of peace. I saw now that letting go wasn't about punishing my parents. It was about releasing us both from expectations that had never fit. I mailed them a box of old family photos, every picture carefully cropped, so that only Lucas and I remained. On top, I left a letter. "This is your family now, in pictures only. Look at us as long as you want, because that's the closest you'll ever get again." I didn't send it in anger, but with clarity. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is make the boundaries unmistakable. The hardest lesson in all of this was learning that forgiveness does not require reconciliation. I could wish my parents healing, even love from afar, without reopening the door to hurt. It took time to accept that some stories don't end with apologies or reunions, but with acceptance and new beginnings. Lucas flourished in this quieter life, his laughter returning, his sense of safety restored. I found that when you stop chasing after approval, you make room for the right people to show up, those who accept you, mess and all. As leaves began to fall and the air turned crisp, I understood the power of choosing yourself and your child over traditions that harm. I realized that sometimes family is something you build, not something you inherit. This chapter had been long and painful, but it taught me to cherish the home Lucas and I created, one built on trust, kindness, and honesty. And as we looked toward the future, I knew we were finally ready to move forward, no longer defined by old wounds, but by the love we chose every single day. The last step in our journey was learning how to fill that home with hope again. Every journey of healing is built on small daily choices. Lucas and I started simple Sunday picnics in the park, baking cookies, just because making new memories that had no shadows attached. The emptiness we'd carried from my childhood was slowly replaced by laughter, by gentle routines, and by the freedom to define our own version of family. Sometimes Lucas would ask questions about the past, but more often he wanted to talk about the present, about school projects, about the friends who made him feel included, about what we'd cook for dinner that night. Little by little, our story turned from survival to true belonging. Looking back, I realized every painful step, the loss, the loneliness, the courage to speak up, had shaped us in ways I never expected. By refusing to stay silent, I'd given Lucas the gift of seeing that he was worth protecting, and I'd given myself the permission to let go of what couldn't be changed. It's easy to think that family is defined by history or tradition, but I learned that real family is built every day with kindness, honesty, and the courage to try again even when it's hard. Our story isn't unique. So many people carry the weight of old wounds, longing for the safety and acceptance they deserve. If you're watching this and see your own experience reflected here, I want you to know you're not alone, and it's never too late to choose a different ending. Healing takes time. It isn't always neat or easy. But every small act of truth, every time you set a boundary, stand up for someone you love, or reach for help, is a victory worth celebrating. The love you give yourself and your children can rewrite everything. If our journey has moved you, if you found hope or strength in these words, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please share your own stories in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from and join our community. By by liking and subscribing. Every voice matters, and every story has the power to inspire someone else to take that first brave step. Thank you for spending this time with us, for listening and believing. Remember, you have the right to create a home filled with the love and safety you and your children deserve, no matter where you started or how alone you once felt. As Lucas and I look toward tomorrow, I hold close the lesson that family is not always where we began, but where we choose to belong. I hope you'll choose that too. Until next time, take care of yourself and those you love, and never forget that your story, just like ours, is far from over.